Okay, this is chapter 14. It is on psychosocial development in early adulthood. And you may remember that early adulthood varies depending on the psychologist that you talk to, but Erikson defined it as the ages of 18 to 25 years old. One common milestone that happens for a lot of people in early adulthood is marriage and family. And one of the questions that people kind of debate over a lot is marriage worth it? And so the question I want you to think of is, why do you think people get married? Do you think that humans are meant to marry, that they're meant to be monogamous? Or do you think that they should have multiple partners and they're not meant to marry? It's just something that our government has created as an institution for various beneficial reasons to their own economy and things of that nature. What we do know is there are some interesting statistics on marriage and family. For example, 95% of Americans get married at some point. We know that 54% of people are married and living with their spouse. 30% of children under 18 years old do live with one parent in a single family home. The average U.S. family has 3.18 people in it. So obviously you can't have 0.18 of a person, but that's just the average. If you take families with 2 kids and 3 kids and average it out, you'll get about 3.18. And we know that the age of the first marriage for females is 25, and for males, it's 27. And this is later than people have been marrying at the beginning of the 20th century. And so when we look to discover why that is, what we usually theorize in psychology is that people are marrying at a later age now because women have jobs, they have educations, and they're not so reliant or dependent on men as they were at the beginning of the 1900s. And so because of this independence and freedom and pursuing the career, it's kind of pushing back marriage and family a little bit later. Another interesting statistic is that white men in the military are 3 times more likely to marry outside of their race, and women in the military are 7 times more likely to marry outside of their race. And it's theorized that the reason for this is because people in the military are going overseas, they're being exposed to different cultures, they're meeting people all over the world, and this, of course, leaves them more open-minded and also gives them experience and access to people outside of their race that they might not have had if they remained in their small town in the Midwest or wherever they're from. We also know that as of late there has been an increase in divorce, and the explanation for that is theorized to be that there has been a liberalization of divorce laws. For example, no-fault divorce. You don't have to have a specific outlying circumstance that occurred to justify the divorce. You can get a divorce because you no longer want to be married, which wasn't how it always was. It's more socially accepted to be divorced than it was maybe 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And now that women are working and going to school and aren't as dependent on men, maybe in the 1950s, women that were unhappy in marriages didn't really have an out because they didn't have education, they didn't have a job, so they completely relied on their husband for their survival financially. But now that women are working and are going to school, they're not so dependent, and so they do have an out in the event that they want to get a divorce. And then also, there has been a reduction in the cost of divorce. It's not quite as expensive as it used to be. However, it's still pretty expensive. The average divorce costs about $50,000. So, when people do get married, one of the things that we often see is that they start to isolate themselves a little bit. And this is true of people in relationships as well, that they kind of spend less time with friends and families. But research actually shows that this is not healthy for us. Studies show that children and adults with friends and family are happier and better adjusted. And we know that friend support predicts happiness and adjustment actually better than family support. So in other words, we tend to do better when we have that social support, seemingly, especially from our friends. Another study observed married couples before and after having kids, And what it found was that people reported higher marital satisfaction if their pregnancy was planned versus an oops. Couples with symptoms of depression before birth reported less marital satisfaction after their child was born. We also know that marital satisfaction decreased over time for parents of girls. I was actually just talking to my sister-in-law about this the other day, and she theorizes that that is due to all the financial costs associated with girls. She said that there's just so many more clothing options and bows and things to buy for girls than there are to buy for boys. So I'm not sure why, and the research doesn't explain why marital satisfaction decreases more if you have a girl than if you have a boy, but that's at least my sister-in-law's theory. So the last finding from this study was that people reported having higher marital satisfaction if at least one parent had positive problem-solving communication skills. So if at least one person in the relationship was good at communication, especially when it came to managing problems that may arise with the baby or financially, things of that nature. There are different types of marriage all around the world and at this particular time in history. But the most common, at least in our country and in most other nations, is monogamy. And so this is considered a marriage where there is one wife and one husband. Not all monogamous relationships are faithful, as you can see on the slide there with the Clintons, but it is defined, at least for our purposes, as one husband and one wife. There's also what's known as polygamy, and this is the marriage in which there is one husband but two or more wives. It's common in some religious sections of our country and in other cultures. For example, it's common in Utah's Mormons, but it's decreasing. It's becoming less and less common. Another type of polygamy is polyandry, and this is marriage in which there is one wife but two husbands, or even potentially more husbands. It's really the rarest type of marriage, and it's really only practiced when there are few females in the culture. So let's go ahead and watch a video on polyandry.
It's called polyandry, one woman, several husbands. It's an unusual arrangement. Today, polyandry only persists in isolated villages in the Himalayas. When it was time for Sunita Kumari to wed, her family, like many in India, made arrangements. But they involved more than a dowry and a celebration. Sunita has not one husband, not two husbands, but three, all brothers. What must her life be like? Westerners might find the practice shocking, but for this community it works fine. One reason, sheer practicality. In the Himalayas, arable land is scarce, farms are tiny. If each generation divided each family's holdings, everyone would starve. Polyandry preserves the farm and the family's future. Unlike most men in India, husbands here handle domestic duties. They're willing to help with the cooking and childcare. In fraternal polyandry, a family picks a wife for its oldest son. The marriage can also include his younger brothers. They don't have to join in, but most do.
No one takes a decision regarding one's own marriage. Everyone at home sits down together, and then it is decided with the consent of everyone.
Polyandry also functions as a form of birth control. No matter how many husbands she has, a wife can get pregnant only so often. If each man were to wed separately, the population here would explode. But what about sex, the forbidden core of the polyandry taboo? In truth, it's a matter of scheduling, and on the wife's part, forbearance.
Tolerance is very important. The wife has to understand everything. The older brother's nature, the younger brother's nature.
What about jealousy, that bane of even the most mundane marriage?
If the wife is smart,
She will take turns each night and sleep with all the brothers. It's not like the older brother wants her the whole time.
Until recently, no one here much cared what the outside world thought. Isolation had preserved a way of life that had withered everywhere else. But a road now links the region to distant cities. And on roofs, once decorated only with prayer flags, satellite dishes sprout. This village has entered the modern world, whose images of romance stand in sharp contrast to polyandry. But polyandry here faces a bigger threat: education.
As more people are becoming more educated, we are also practicing family planning. If a father has only one son, there will be no question about the land. Therefore, common marriages will come to an end.
In 2, perhaps 3 generations, polyandry may vanish here. But for now, those who practice it find comfort in the familiar.
I myself feel that common marriage is very good. I feel like everyone should live like our family. Even if we do not have anything to eat or drink, we sit happily, we live peacefully.
The third type of marriage we're going to discuss is group marriage. And this is marriage that includes 2 or more husbands and wives who all exercise common privileges and responsibilities, so they really share the household duties, so to speak. In the 60s and 70s, this gained a lot of attention. There were some movies made about it, and with all kind of the hippie communes and free love culture, it was thought that this might be a good way to live life by sharing responsibilities amongst a group of people. But really, since the 60s and 70s, this idea of group marriage has declined. Another type of marriage is homosexual marriage. Although it's not accepted legally on a federal level, there are lots of states now that have legalized homosexual marriage, or at the very least civil unions and domestic partnerships. So you can go ahead and look at the slide to see all the states that have currently legalized homosexual marriage. And there are some myths about homosexual marriages, that they are significantly different from heterosexual marriages, and research finds that this is just not true. There's 5 particular factors that one piece of research looked at in terms of homosexual and heterosexual marriages, and found that there was no difference between the 2 on problem solving, intimacy, equality, autonomy, which just means allowing your partner to have independence and feeling like they're in a self-governed state, responsible for themselves, and barriers from leaving. So research also shows that parents of children that are homosexual, the parents are homosexual, not the children, they are no more likely to raise children that are homosexual. So in other words, the kids of homosexual parents are no more likely to become homosexual than children of straight parents. Okay, what I would like for you to do now is pause the video, head on over to Moodle, and complete lecture activity 1. When you're finished with that, come on back. Okay, so there was a developmental psychologist by the name of Daniel J. Levenson. He worked at Yale, and he died somewhat recently in 1994. He was interested in the similarities in the adult life cycle. What were the common things that we all kind of experience as we hit adulthood and go through it? And he did find that we actually go through kind of the same things. The only problem with his theory is that he really only researched how it applies to men. But since then, it's been kind of generalized to women and said that it fits for women as well to a certain extent. So the first term you need to know from Levenson's theory of the adult life cycle is the term life cycle. And so life cycle is a general pattern of adult development, which is meaning that if you were to kind of lay out a map of what most adults do, that map would represent the life cycle. For example, maybe most adults get in a serious relationship, and then they get engaged, and then married, and move in together, and then have children. So this pattern of behavior that we see to be true for most adults would be considered the life cycle according to Levenson. The next term you need to know is life course, and this refers to the way an individual completes their life cycle. And so while the life cycle is the same pattern for most of us, how we go about completing that life cycle, who we choose to marry, the career we choose to have, how many kids we choose to have, is unique to each individual. So in that way, we are unique snowflakes. The next term that you need to know is life structure, and this is the underlying pattern or design of an individual's life at a specific time in their life. So you can think back to what your life looked like when you were a kid, and then when you were a teenager, and then maybe as an adult, so on and so forth. And at each phase of your life, there's been different influences, different things that shape how you are acting, how you are feeling, how you are thinking, what you're doing, where you're going, what commitments you have. And so all of that together creates your life structure. The strongest influence we find on someone's life structure, how your life looks, is usually your relationships, kind of have the most powerful hold on the shape of your life at a given time. Another term you need to know is transition, and this just refers to the period between life structures or the period between phases. So as we're transitioning from childhood to adolescence and adolescence to early adulthood, we're going through a period of change between our life structures. The life structure includes an alternating series of what Levenson called structure building and structure changing. Structure building is when individuals face the task of building a stable structure around choices they've made. For example, getting married, starting a family, buying a home. And during the structure building period, it usually lasts about 5 to 7 years. And individuals look to enhance the life structure to make this particular life structure that they're in the best it can possibly be. And so Levenson refers to this as a period of stability. Then there is structure changing, and this is the process of reappraising the existing life structure and exploring the possibilities for new life structure. It's kind of reflecting on where your life's at right now and seeing if you can benefit from making a change. For example, a 7-year itch in a relationship. So the structure changing period lasts about 5 years, and at the end of it, a person knows what they will take into their new life structure and what they will leave behind. So Levenson really refers to this as a period of change. And it happens primarily when we become focused on new developmental tasks, when we want to grow as people and push ourselves to the next level and become a better version of ourselves. Levenson said that throughout the lifespan there are 4 stages, and these stages can overlap. For example, childhood and adolescence is what he considers the first stage, and this is from birth to 22 years old. Early adulthood, which is from 17 to 45, according to Levenson. Middle adulthood, which is from 40 to 65, and then older adulthood from 60 to death. At each developmental stage, Levenson says we do something called individuate. And we do this further and further as we go through each stage. Individuation refers to our becoming more of an individual, developing a separate and special personality from our friends, from our parents, derived less and less from those influences in our life and more from our own behavior and our own experiences. So to individuate really means to become your own individual, to become your own self. Levenson said that one of the life structures we go through is the novice phase, and this is the period of ages between 17 and 33 that includes that early adulthood transition when we're becoming early adults, when we're entering in the adult world and going kind of into that age of 30. In this phase, the novice phase, 4 major tasks must be accomplished. The first is called the dream, and this is where the early adult really starts to create a life vision, decides maybe what they want to do for a career, or if they want to be in a relationship, if they want to work 9 to 5, if they want to have kids, where they want to live. They kind of get a framework or a structure for how their dream life would look. And then the second part of the novice phase is a mentor relationship. And so this is to find an older, more experienced person who will make suggestions at critical points in your early adulthood. And so Levenson believed that most people in this stage do find some type of mentor, whether it be a professor, a coworker, a boss, a parent, someone that can help kind of navigate through early adulthood. The next task of the novice phase is occupational design, and this is when the early adult builds on strengths and finds a job that utilizes those strengths. So they really come to know their strengths and weaknesses and then figure out a way to get into a career that exploits what they're good at. And the fourth task is love relationships. And so, again, remember, this is mostly geared towards men. So Levenson said that in the love relationship task, the man makes a decision on his wife, if he's going to have one, what she would be like, what traits she would possess, what characteristics, what if he's going to have children or not, how those children might act or behave, and the kind of relationship he would want to have with them. So what would he look like as a father and a husband, for example? So all of this on the to-do list in the novice phase would be a period of structure building. But after the structure building, after the to-do list is accomplished, which Levenson said usually happens by age 30, then the individual must re-examine and begin a process of structure changing. So they have to look back at their dream life. Have they accomplished what they wanted to accomplish? What is their marital status? How's their career going? What's going on with their mentor? Are they still in their lives? And these things often change during this structure changing period. And so this is a major transitional period where many men feel severe self-doubt. Most men emerge with a better understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, however. That leads us to Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. In this stage, Erikson believed that the major task was intimacy versus isolation. And he defined intimacy as the ability to relate one's deepest hopes and fears to another person and to accept another's need for intimacy in turn. And so some of the things that he said intimacy should include is mutuality of orgasm with a loved partner of the opposite sex, being with someone that you trust and that trusts you, being with someone that you can handle situations of work, having children, and recreation with, meaning you like the same things, you like to do the same things, you both want kids, and you can deal with the day-to-day hassles that come up in regards to life. But he said that intimacy is not just about sex, but it's about a deep human connection. And so there are some components of intimacy that you'll need to know. The first is solidarity, and this is Erikson's term for the personality style of people who are able to commit themselves in concrete affiliations and partnerships. This includes the ethical strength necessary to uphold the commitment of a relationship, even if that means great sacrifice and compromise. So a person that engages in solidarity is more likely to experience intimacy because they are flexible and they're willing to compromise and they are willing to sacrifice when necessary. Erikson also points out that a lot of us contain what he called distantiation, and this is the readiness of all of us to distance ourselves from others when we feel threatened by their behavior. So if you've ever said that you don't need anyone or that you could just cut people out of your life easily, Erikson argues that we all have this ability, and he calls it distantiation. It's the counterpart or the antonym to intimacy. He says that we all do this when or if we engage in prejudice and discrimination. He said that countries at war attempt to get their people to distantiate using propaganda about the country they're in war with. And he says that most young people go back and forth between wanting intimacy, wanting that closeness, bondedness, connectedness, and their need for distantiation. He says that we have this need, especially during this age, because the social distance that we create allows us to kind of work further on our identity. And we also need that social distance because we are not sure yet of our identity. He says that also we're always vulnerable to criticism, but not knowing if criticism is true or not leads us to wanting to be alone, leads us to want to distantiate. But distantiation, according to Erikson, leads to isolation. And so this is kind of not successfully completing this task of psychosocial development would be to end up in isolation. But Erikson does argue that we all have a readiness to isolate ourselves from others, especially if we feel threatened by their behavior. And it doesn't have to mean physically threatened, but emotionally threatened or psychologically threatened, mentally threatened. And so he said isolation is just a more extreme version of distantiation. Okay, so let's look at how we develop our gender roles and sexual identity and how those things affect our perception of ourselves and our experience of life. But let's start by determining the difference between sex and gender. So sex is your genetic makeup, your biological predisposition if you have male hormones or female hormones, male genitalia or female genitalia, and so your sexual identity results from these physical characteristics. And then we have gender, which is kind of your level of masculinity or femininity. And gender roles are results from cultural and societal standards and traits for how a particular gender should act. Okay, let's watch a quick clip that goes into further explanation on the difference between gender and sex and a bunch of other terms that are related to the topic.
Good morning, John. Today, we plumb the depths of the marvelously complex human. But first, allow me to acknowledge that I am not a sociologist. I am also a straight white man who doesn't have to worry about a lot of the hate that a lot of other people do have to worry about. But my goal with this video is I want people to understand, because I think understanding will lead to less hate and also less self-hate. For a lot of people, it's nice to imagine that humans are simple and that you can know a person's sex and then you will know all sorts of things about them deeply and clearly. And if you don't fit into this nice little box, people who do can get really confused and sometimes even angry. And if you yourself don't fit into one of these nice little boxes and you think that people should, then you end up hating yourself. And that's probably even worse. I think the best and maybe only way to solve this problem is for people to understand that there are no nice shiny boxes. Or if there are shiny boxes, there are an infinite number of them, enough to put all of the people who currently exist, have ever existed, and will ever exist. So, together, let's understand. We're gonna start simple. What's going on down here, in between the legs? That is your sex, your biological sex, and it tends to be binary, though there are all sorts of conditions that result in intersex individuals. And as interesting and complicated as this is, the rest of it is much more complicated, so I'm just gonna move on from here, because we all kind of get what sex is. Now we move on up to the top, to the brain, which is the thing that decides what gender you identify with, whether you feel like a man or a woman or neither or both, because the fascinating thing is, as much as we try to label things, there is no way to label every point on an infinite continuum, and that's what we're dealing with here. So, to actually visualize how this works, I've created a graph for you. On the x-axis, we have gender, male to female, and on the y-axis, we have the intensity of the identification with that gender. I would be about here, because I identify as a man, though I recognize that there are some womany parts of me, but let's also put a hypothetical biological female on the graph that identifies very strongly as a man. Now that can be really uncomfortable, especially when there's a bunch of people in the world who insist on calling him a woman just because of the body that he happens to be very uncomfortable with. Which is why sex does not determine the pronoun you should use. gender does. Now, moving on to your heart, your metaphorical heart, of course. This is who you're attracted to. Men, women, all genders. Again, it's a spectrum, and that spectrum includes intensity, because there are people who don't feel strong sexual attraction at all. That's why asexual is a sexual orientation. A newer idea that I was happy to be exposed to yesterday on Tumblr is the idea of romantic orientation. These are the people that you want to have strong, intimate relationships with, but it sort of separates out the idea that sex has to be the goal or end point or like end all and be all of every intimate relationship. Now that we've dealt with how we feel, let's deal with what happens when other people actually get involved. That's sexual behavior, which is actually very different from sexual orientation. Now that might seem a little bit strange at first, but it's not. Consider, for example, a heterosexual priest. That priest's orientation is heterosexual, but because of his religion, his behavior is celibate. Here we're not talking about the preference, we're talking about the behavior. Now built on top of all of this are gender roles, which are built by societies, not by individuals. The obvious ones are masculine gender roles and feminine gender roles, but as all dichotomies are false dichotomies, this one is a spectrum too. Now that we've sort of gone over all of this, it's important to note that every single one of these categories is independent from each other. So a biological female can be a man who only has sex with women despite the fact that he's attracted to both men and women and kind of feels more comfortable in feminine gender roles. That may not be the most common combination of these factors, but it's certainly not weird. And another important point, many people move across these spectrums, sometimes from year to year, sometimes hour to hour. But what's really important is that we trust ourselves, and we understand ourselves, and we love and respect ourselves, and we grant that same understanding and respect to the people around us. Because when the world becomes one of infinite continuums and those false dichotomies break down, and those 2 shiny boxes break apart into 7 billion shiny boxes, that's actually pretty beautiful. John, I'll see you on Tuesday.
Some people may reject both their sexual identity and their gender role. For example, a person like Chaz Bono, who was born a woman but felt like a man inside. This would be someone that we call transgender. And transsexualism or being transgender may come from life experiences. It may be come from childhood events or hormones. But regardless of what causes someone to be transgender, people report feeling much better after they actually are able to express themselves as the gender that they feel inside. So if they feel like a man in a woman's body and they're able to get their body to match their gender, they usually are much happier, healthier, more successful. They feel better about who they are. So this issue of what causes transgender people is debatable in psychology just because we don't really have enough information to make a determination on whether it's due to nature or nurture. However, we do have a lot more information that points in the direction of nature. We see a lot of hormonal evidence that might shape our gender. And another piece of evidence that kind of supports this idea that gender might be determined, perhaps even in the womb, is children that report or display being transgender. So let's go ahead and watch a clip of transgender children in America.
More than 4 years ago, Haley's parents, Barb and Steve, began to recognize that there was something different about their youngest boy.
From the time Haley could express herself, it really was feminine. She always gravitated toward dolls and, flowers.
Right? But it wasn't just that Haley seemed to prefer girls' things, the pink side of the world to the blue. Something else was going on.
We noticed that she was depicting herself as a girl in all of her pictures. Any self-portrait was all girl, every time.
So what's this?
Picture of fairy.
I noticed that you have high-heeled shoes on in your fairy picture. Fairies don't wear high-heeled shoes,
Yes,
do they? They do? In kindergarten, Haley began to assert herself in a whole new way.
One day we heard from the teacher that Haley was in school having arguments with the boys, saying, "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl."
Then, Steve and Barb's youngest son, Harry, changed his name to Haley all on his own. Barb and Steve met with therapist after therapist. They heard the same word over and over again, transgender. But their child was only 5.
I remember the minute we were in the car, I just burst into tears.
And that moment was so, profound. I mean, I felt like I got dagger in my stomach. I was like, you know, I was so angry. I was incredibly angry.
How could someone feel they were born in the wrong body at such a young age? Haley's story made me wonder how early we're aware of ourselves as male or female. For Steve, a Lutheran and Sunday school teacher, his child challenged the most basic beliefs he held.
I really had a far different feeling about gender and sexuality. I was embarrassed and felt, you know, ashamed a little bit.
Here we go, deposit.
I still was believing that this was some sort of a phase and this was not going to be permanent.
Do you think the possibility exists that this still may just be a phase?
I don't think that's going to happen now. If it does, it'll be okay with me. But I believe with conviction that my child here is exactly who she is. God made her just like this.
No one knows why people are transgender. There are only theories. Some think that it starts in the womb with hormone imbalances that change the brain to identify with the opposite gender. What is clear is that many transgender people are, like Haley, strongly aware of who they are inside at an early age. And this secret knowledge can lead them to a difficult future. Many transgender children grow up hating their bodies and fall victim to high rates of depression, drug abuse, and suicide. For Barb and Steve, the choice was clear: to support their child in order to save her from a future of heartache and pain. But they face a world that may not be as accepting of their choices.
There's some people who might say, you're encouraging this kind of behavior, that you are encouraging this little boy to be something that he's not. How do you respond to that?
I certainly didn't wish this upon my child. This is going to be a hard road.
I can't even get my children to use a napkin at dinner time. You know, you think I'm going to be able to get my child to change genders? I can't get her to brush her teeth at night, for heaven's sake. What we've done is finally come to terms ourselves with, you know, how to raise a healthy child instead of raising a child who feels some sense of shame or secrecy about who she is, you know?
For now, Haley's friends are accepting. But Barb and Steve know it's going to get harder for her.
For right now, right here, first grade's pretty safe, but the future can be really scary. They go into adolescence and puberty, and then things get complicated.
The last few months have seen her becoming sort of more cognizant and more aware of, but other girls don't have a penis. Other girls don't have the body that I have.
Sometimes I sit there and I get really concerned, you know, who's gonna love my child, you know? Who's gonna fall in love with her?
For now, it's all about loving Haley as the little girl she feels she is. But the physical reality of being a biological male is going to catch up with her. What happens when a transgender child becomes an adult? I'm about to learn that that can bring a whole other set of challenges.
Okay, I'd like you to pause the video here, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 2, and then return to this spot in the lecture. So the way one develops their own gender role differs from person to person, but we see that it usually consists of 3 components. The first is known as gender role orientation, and this is the idea that individuals differ in how confident they feel about their sexual identity. For example, there might be some people who are female but feel uncomfortable with their breasts and try to tape them down or wear baggy shirts or cover them up. Another component is gender role preference. And so there might be a person who's unhappy about their gender role and wish that either society or their sex could be changed. For example, a person that has this issue might say something like, I don't want to act feminine, so either the world needs to accept me acting manly or I need to have surgery to change my sex. And another component of gender role is gender role adaptation. This is if a person is seen as acting quote-unquote appropriately with their gender, then they are considered to have adapted. For example, a boy acting masculine would have gone through gender role adaptation, and girls acting feminine would have gone through gender role adaptation. So none of these are correct. Adaptation sounds like it's synonymous with success, but it's not. So gender role orientation, gender role preference, gender role adaptation are just differences between individuals, but one is not better than the other. When we look at how we do develop our gender, there's really two different views on how this happens. The first is the traditional view that says our gender is a result of the interaction between sex chromosome differences at conception and early treatment by people in the child's environment. So the traditional view is really arguing that our gender is shaped by both nature and nurture. However, we know that culture and even chromosome failure does not usually affect sexual identity. For example, with chromosomal failure, there are biological changes such as enlarged breast in some males and abnormal body hair in some females, yet they don't necessarily have gender role preference or are unhappy with their gender. And then there are people that come from different cultures that are also not acting compatible with the traditional gender roles of that culture. Okay, there's also the evolutionary psychology view of how we develop our gender. And this one says that gender behaviors are pre-programmed into our genes because they are necessary for survival. And so this is why we have certain gender roles according to this view. For example, men are protecting and women are nurturing because women carry the child in their womb, and so they need to be patient and nurturing in order to raise the child. And men are protecting since the woman is in a fragile state while pregnant or caring for a small child. The man needs to protect that woman and child. So these are all just from Darwin's theory, the idea that all of our behavior occurs somewhat unconsciously in an effort to help us adapt, reproduce, and survive within our environment. There are also people that are considered androgynous, which is kind of right in the middle of that continuum of masculinity and femininity. So androgyny is considered a functional level of gender role identification that incorporates both male and female qualities. Psychologists argue that we would actually be healthier if we were more androgynous, and one of the pieces of evidence that they cite for this is a study that found that highly masculine male teens are better adjusted when they are teenagers, but in adulthood they become anxious and have trouble with self-acceptance. And so maybe being a little less masculine would help them to accept themselves and feel more comfortable once they're into adulthood. Okay, so let's take a look at male versus female identity and discuss the difference in identity development between men and women, the difference between genders and how we view ourselves. So the feminist movement really focused on problems in identity development for women. And just so we're clear, the feminist movement was the efforts of some women to secure more equitable standards in the workplace, society, and home. The feminist movement was all about making sure that there was equality between genders. And so one of the things that the feminist movement found when they looked at the difference in identity development between men and women were that men were encouraged to find their identity. They were trained to be independent, competitive, self-sufficient, whereas they found that females really find it harder to individuate, harder to develop their own identity. And some of the reasons they cited for this are that women are trained that it is their job to maintain relationships and family, to sacrifice themselves. And so if you're constantly sacrificing yourself, maybe you're not investing in finding out who you are. Another a reason why females find it hard to individuate, according to the feminist movement and studies on identity development in women, is that women are trained to get and keep the attention of a man. And so, again, it makes it hard to focus on themselves and is considered unhealthy by most psychologists, because instead of just trying to love yourself and get to know yourself, your focus is on doing certain things to attract a man that might not be authentic to who you actually are. Also, women are objectified by society. They're often looked at as sexual objects versus individuals. And men are more likely to view women as the object of their psychological drive for sex than women are to view men as the object of their psychological drive for sex. Women tend to look at the whole situation, who this person is, what their personality traits are, what their accomplishments are, when they are considering whether or not to have sex with them. Whereas men tend to be a lot more visual, and tend to look at women more as an object in some cases than as an individual or as a person. Now, this is not true for all men, certainly, but just for some. And so psychologists argue that this visual predisposition, or the tendency for some men to look at women as objects and to objectify them, might explain why sexual abuse is perpetrated by men more than it is by women. We also know that women are encouraged to be more vulnerable than men. This may be an evolutionary explanation for the vulnerability in women as well. There's something called the bend and bond response. It's the more typically female response to threats. And so what it is to seek a compromise when there's a conflict, whereas the male response is to fight or flight. And it's said that this might be serving an evolutionary purpose, since women are physically weaker than men, and so they are better at communicating emotional needs and being vulnerable and willing to compromise, because they can't fight a man, so they have to find this compromise and this vulnerability and engage in this bend and bond response rather than trying to go toe-to-toe in a fight or flight response with men. Okay, let's look at sexuality and marital practices and the relationship between the two. What's it like being married and having sex? So studies show that young people are having less sex and with fewer partners than a decade ago. Reports also show more use of contraception than ever before, and researchers think that this is due primarily to sex education. So, research finds that both men and women look for someone similar to them in age, education, and values when looking for a sexual or a romantic partner. We also find that women tend to care more about occupation, religion, and the desire to have children one day when seeking out a mate, whereas men tend to care more about physical attractiveness than any other quality. In regards to sex during marriage, we find that sexual closeness tends to lessen with the birth of each child. Research also finds that couples who live together before marriage for a shorter amount of time are actually more likely to divorce. And when divorce occurs, women cite infidelity as the primary reason. However, both men and women cite emotional problems as the most frequent cause for divorce. Research shows that young adults have the same amount of sex as people over the age of 55 and less sex than middle-aged adults, believe it or not. So there is a misconception that as you get older and you're married longer, you completely stop having sex. Research shows that this is just not true for all people. For some people, of course, but not for everyone. Okay, so let's take a look at love. What is love? What happens biologically when we are in love? Are there different types of love? And so we definitely have a certain biological change when we are in love. In the first 6 months on average of being interested in someone or attracted to someone or potentially in love with someone, we get this crazy chemical cocktail of neurotransmitters in our brain, or brain chemicals. We get oxytocin, which makes us feel more bonded. We get dopamine, which makes us feel pleasure. We get serotonin, which affects our mood, our sleep, even our appetite. So sometimes when people are in love, they eat more. Sometimes they eat less. Sometimes they can't sleep because they're so in love in these first 6 months. But at any rate, we know that when a person is in love, their brain is certainly going through a lot. And to really illustrate this, we're going to watch a TED Talk on a woman named Helen Fisher, who is one of the leading experts in the study of love.
I and my colleagues Art Aaron and Lucy Brown and others have put 37 people who are madly in love into a functional MRI brain scanner. 17 who are happily in love, 15 who had just been dumped, and we're just starting our third experiment, studying people who report that they're still in love after 10 to 25 years of marriage. So this is the short story of that research. In the jungles of Guatemala in Tikal stands a temple. It was built by the grandest Sun King of the grandest city-state, of the grandest civilization of the Americas, the Mayas. His name was Casacanchawi. He stood over 6 feet tall. He lived into his 80s, and he was buried beneath this monument in 720 AD. And Mayan inscriptions proclaim that he was deeply in love with his wife, so he built a temple in her honor facing his. And every spring and autumn, exactly at the equinox, the sun rises behind his temple and perfectly bathes her temple with his shadow. And as the sun sets behind her temple in the afternoon, it perfectly bathes his temple with her shadow. After 1,300 years, these two lovers still touch and kiss from their tomb. Around the world, people love. They sing for love. They dance for love. They compose poems and stories about love. They tell myths and legends about love. They pine for love. They live for love. They kill for love. And they die for love. As Walt Whitman once said, he said, "Oh, I would stake all for you." Anthropologists have found evidence of romantic love in 170 societies. They've never found a society that did not have it. But love isn't always a happy experience. In one study of college students, they asked a lot of questions about love, but the two that stood out to me the most were, have you ever been rejected by somebody who you really loved? And the second question was, have you ever dumped somebody who really loved you? And almost 95% of both men and women said yes to both. Almost nobody gets out of love alive. So before I start telling you about the brain, I want to read for you what I think is the most powerful love poem on earth. There's other love poems that are, of course, just as good, but I don't think this one can be surpassed. It was told by an anonymous Kwakiutl Indian of southern Alaska to a missionary in 1896. Here it is. I've never had the opportunity to say it before. Fire runs through my body with the pain of loving you. Pain runs through my body with the fires of my love for you. Pain like a boil about to burst with my love for you. Consumed by fire with my love for you. I remember what you said to me. I am thinking of your love for me. I am torn by your love for me. Pain and more pain. Where are you going with my love? I am told you will go from here. I am told you will leave me here. My body is numb with grief. Remember what I said, my love. Goodbye, my love, goodbye. Emily Dickinson once wrote, "Parting is all we need to know of hell." How many people have suffered in all the millions of years of human evolution? How many people around the world are dancing with elation at this very minute? Romantic love is one of the most powerful sensations on earth. So several years ago, I decided to look into the brain and study this madness. Our first study of people who are happily loved has been widely publicized, so I'm only going to say very little about it. we found activity in a tiny little factory near the base of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. We found activity in some cells called the A10 cells, cells that actually make dopamine, a natural stimulant, and spray it to many brain regions. Indeed, this part, the VTA, is part of the brain's reward system. It's way below your cognitive thinking process. It's below your emotions. It's part of what we call the reptilian core of the brain, associated with wanting, with motivation, with focus, and with craving. In fact, the same brain region where we found activity becomes active also when you feel the rush of cocaine. But romantic love is much more than a cocaine high. At least you come down from cocaine. Romantic love is an obsession. It possesses you. You lose your sense of self. You can't stop thinking about another human being. Somebody is camping in your head. As an 8th century Japanese poet said, "My longing had no time when it ceases. Wild is love." And the obsession can get worse when you've been rejected. So right now, Lucy Brown and I, the neuroscientist on our project, are looking at the data of the people who we put into the machine after they had just been dumped. It was very difficult, actually, putting these people in the machine because they were in such bad shape. So anyway, we found activity in 3 brain regions. We found activity in a brain region, in exactly the same brain region associated with intense romantic love. What a bad deal. You know, when you've been dumped, the one thing you'd love to do is just forget about this human being and then go on with your life. But no, you just love them harder. As the poet Terence, the Roman poet, once said, he said, "The less my hope, the hotter my love." And indeed, we now know why. 2,000 years later, we can explain this in the brain. That brain system, the reward system for wanting, for motivation, for craving, for focus, becomes more active when you can't get what you want. In this case, life's greatest prize, an appropriate mating partner. We found activity in other brain regions also, in a brain region associated with calculating gains and losses. You know, you're lying there, you're looking at the picture, you're in this machine, you're calculating, you know, what went wrong, you know, what have I lost? As a matter of fact, Lucy and I have a little joke about this. It comes from a David Mamet play, and there's 2 con artists in the play, and the woman is conning the man, and the man looks at the woman and says, "Oh, you're a bad pony. I'm not going to bet on you." And indeed, it's this brain, part of the brain, the core of the nucleus accumbens actually, that's becoming active as you're measuring your gains and losses. It's also the brain region that becomes active when you're willing to take enormous risks for huge gains and huge losses. Last but not least, we found activity in the brain region associated with deep attachment to another individual. No wonder people suffer around the world, and we have so many crimes of passion. When you've been rejected in love, not only are you engulfed with feelings of romantic love, but you're feeling deep attachment to this individual. Moreover, this brain circuit for reward is working, and you're feeling intense energy, intense focus, intense motivation, and the willingness to risk it all to win life's greatest prize. So what have I learned from this experiment that I would like to tell the world? Foremost, I've come to think that romantic love is a drive, a basic mating drive. Not the sex drive. The sex drive gets you out there looking for a whole range of partners. Romantic love enables you to focus your mating energy on just one at a time, conserve your mating energy, and start the mating process with a single individual. I think of all of the poetry that I've read about romantic love, what sums it up best is something that is said by Plato. Over 2,000 years ago. He said, "The God of love lives in the state of need." It is a need. It is an urge. It is a homeostatic imbalance. Like hunger and thirst, it's almost impossible to stamp out. I've also come to believe that romantic love is an addiction, a perfectly wonderful addiction when it's going well, and a perfectly horrible addiction when it's going poorly. And indeed, it has all of the characteristics of an addiction. You focus on the person, you obsessively think about them, you crave them, you distort reality, your willingness to take enormous risks to win this person. And it's got the 3 main characteristics of addiction: tolerance, you need to see more and more and more, withdrawals, and last but not relapse. I've got got a girlfriend who's just getting over a terrible love affair. It's been about 8 months. She's beginning to feel better. And she was driving along in her car the other day, and suddenly she heard a song on the car radio that reminded her of this man. And she, not only did the instant craving come back, but she had to pull over the road, from the side of the road, and cry. So one thing I would like the medical community and the legal community and even the college community to see if they can understand that indeed romantic love is one of the most addictive substances on earth. I would also like to tell the world that animals love. There's not an animal on this planet that'll copulate with anything that comes along. Too old, too young, too scruffy, too stupid, and they won't do it. Unless you're stuck in a laboratory cage, if you spend your entire life in a little box, you're not going to be as picky about who you have sex with. But I've looked in 100 species, and everywhere in the wild, animals have favorites. As a matter of fact, ethologists know this. There's over eight words for what they call animal favoritism, selective proceptivity, mate choice, female choice, sexual choice. And indeed, there are now 3 academic articles in which they've looked at this attraction, which may only last for a second, but it's a definite attraction, and this either the same brain region, this reward system, or the chemicals of that reward system are involved. In fact, I think animal attraction can be instant. You can see an elephant instantly go for another elephant, and I think that this is really the origins of what you and I call love at first sight. People have often asked me whether what I know about love has spoiled it for me. And I just simply say, hardly. You can know every single ingredient in a piece of chocolate cake, and then when you sit down and eat that cake, you can still feel that joy. And certainly I make all the same mistakes everybody else does too. But it's really deepened my understanding and compassion, really, for all human life. As a matter of fact, in New York, I often catch myself looking in baby carriages and feeling a little sorry for the tot. And in fact, sometimes I feel a little sorry for the chicken on my dinner plate when I think of how intense this brain system is. Our newest experiment is been hatched by my colleague Art Aaron, putting people who are reporting that they are still in love in a long-term relationship into the functional MRI. We've put 5 people in so far, and indeed we found exactly the same thing. They're not lying. They basically, the brain areas associated with intense romantic love still become active 25 years later. There are still many questions to be answered and asked about romantic love. The question that I'm working on right this minute, and I'm only going to say it for a second and then end, is why do you fall in love with one person rather than another? The reason I never would have even thought to think of this, but Match.com, the internet dating site, came to me 3 years ago and asked me that question. And I said, I don't know. I know what happens in the brain when you do become in love, but I don't know why you fall in love with one person rather than another. And so I've spent the last 3 years on this, and there's many reasons that you fall in love with one person rather than another that psychologists can tell you. And we tend to fall in love with somebody from the same socioeconomic background, the same general level of intelligence, the same general level of good looks, the same religious values. Your childhood certainly plays a role, but nobody knows how. And that's about it. That's all they know. No, they've never found the way 2 personalities fit together to make a good relationship. So it began to occur to me that maybe your biology pulls you towards some people rather than another. And I have concocted a questionnaire to see to what degree you express dopamine, serotonin, estrogen, and testosterone. I think we've evolved 4 very broad personality types associated with the ratios of these 4 chemicals in the brain. And on this dating site that I've created called chemistry.com, I ask you first a series of questions to see to what degree you express these chemicals, and I'm watching who chooses who to love. And 3.7 million people have taken the questionnaire in America. About 600,000 people have taken it in 33 other countries. I'm putting the data together now, and at some point, There will always be magic to love, but I think I will come closer to understanding why it is you can walk into a room and everybody is from your background, your same general level of intelligence, your same general level of good looks, and you don't feel pulled towards all of them. I think there's biology to that. I think we're going to end up in the next few years to understand all kinds of brain mechanisms that pull us to one person rather than another. So I will close with this. Oh, these are my older people. Faulkner once said, "The past is not dead. It's not even the past." Indeed, we carry a lot of luggage from our yesteryear in the human brain. And so there's one thing that makes me pursue my understanding of human nature. And this reminds me of it. These are two women. Women tend to get intimacy differently than men do. Women get intimacy from face-to-face talking. We swivel towards each other. We do what we call the anchoring gaze, and we talk. This is intimacy to women. I think it comes from millions of years of holding that baby in front of your face, cajoling it, reprimanding it, educating it with words. Men tend to get intimacy from side-by-side doing. As soon as one guy looks up, the other guy will look away. I think it comes from millions of years of standing behind that bush, sitting behind the bush, looking straight ahead, trying to hit that buffalo in the head with a rock. I think for millions of years, men faced their enemies. They sat side by side with friends. So my final statement is, love is in us. It's deeply embedded in the brain. Our challenge is to understand each other. Thank you.
So what is love? Well, it's a little bit difficult to define, but love, in terms of romantic sexual interest, at least in the early stages, is characterized by an intense physical arousal. Every time you think of the person, you get butterflies. When they walk past you, you blush. An all-encompassing interest in another individual. Every song that comes on the radio was written just for the two of you. Fantasizing constantly about the other person. Relatively rapid swings of emotion. Whether they're paying attention to you or not really affects the mood that you're in. And then the exaggeration of the other person's good qualities and a minimization of their negative ones. Robert Sternberg came up with a very popular theory of love that characterizes love in an interpersonal relationship on 3 different factors: intimacy, passion, and commitment. So intimacy is not referring to sex in this case, but how close and connected and bonded to someone you feel. Passion, which encompasses the drives that lead to romance, physical attraction, and eventually or often sex. And then the third factor is commitment, which in the short term is the decision that one loves another person, and in the long term is the decision to maintain that love. So these factors actually exist on continuum individually. So intimacy can be low or high in a relationship. Passion can be low or high. Commitment can be low or high. A relationship based on one of these factors is less likely to survive than one that's based on 2 or more. And the kind of love that one experiences depends on the combination of these factors. So if you look on the slide, you can see that romantic love is characterized by intimacy and passion, for example, but no commitment. Empty love is characterized by decision and commitment, for example, but no passion. Sternberg found that the type of love we experience in a relationship changes over time. So when we look at couples that have been together for, say, 25 years, we find that they cycle through all the different types of love you see there on the slide throughout the course of their relationship. So there are maybe weeks, months, or years when they are in that romantic love stage, and then there are a few days, weeks, months, or years when they're in that empty love. We know that relationships certainly do ebb and flow, have good days and bad days. However, our culture emphasizes love as being romantic love, that's what love looks like all the time, and that's just not what research shows. In other cultures, especially Eastern cultures, They emphasize companion love, which is really about kind of that commitment and that bondedness and closeness. Because of all the factors, the one that is most likely to fade away or decrease on the scale or on the continuum is passion. And then Sternberg's theory suggests that the ultimate goal of all of us is actually to have that consummate love, intimacy, passion, and commitment, hopefully on the high end of their continuums. As human beings, we understand that our perception varies from person to person. And so maybe you have one opinion on how something is, and I have a different opinion on how something is. And because we are aware that our perceptions differ, this causes us to need validation from other people. So validation is a term that a psychologist named Fromm used, and it's defined as the reciprocal sharing of deep secrets and feelings that allow people to feel loved and accepted. When we tell people, you are not crazy in that perception, you are not crazy in that opinion, I feel the same way as you. This makes us feel validated. And when someone continues to validate our feelings, we often come to love them. It plays a major role in our loving relationships, this validation that we get from other people. It's often said in psychology that we like people that are like us, that see the world the same way we see it. However, when we share our inner feelings and secrets with people, we do become vulnerable. And so this need for validation can act kind of as a double-edged sword. Because when we are vulnerable with people and express our deep, dark secrets, they can use our vulnerabilities to hurt us. And this is actually one of the reasons for divorce, because no one knows how to hurt us better than our spouse. They have all the ammunition. They have all of our deepest, darkest secrets. Studies show that we do need validation for our sanity, and people who try to live without love and the validation that comes from love risk their mental stability. Okay, that concludes this chapter. Head on over to Moodle and complete the journal and forum, and we'll see you for the next chapter. Bye-bye.